I'm James Howell, and this is the first episode of 11th Heaven Critical Suplex, an extended look at Grasshopper Manufacture's 2007 game No More Heroes, written and directed by Suda51. Heaven 1. Introduction and Death Metal. I've wanted to do something with No More Heroes for several years, but I haven't had an overarching, unifying idea about the game like with MGS2 or Killer 7. I've had notes for several smaller pieces about No More Heroes, but I drift toward larger, more expansive projects instead of shorter-form critical writings, so I'm using a different format this time through. Lacking much long-form to say about the game myself, I'm inviting others on during the boss fights to discuss those segments and the game overall. Got a great bunch of people on board. We'll hear from video game critics, seasoned developers and artists, poets, and a few entertainers and actors besides. But for this first episode, you're stuck with just me. As far as I go, I have a pretty involved history with the game. When I last played No More Heroes in 2008, I was juggling grad school, running a small but powerful translation business, tutoring undergrads, writing freelance for game magazines like PlayStation Magazine and Hardcore Gamer, and I was localizing games at home and abroad. I also listened to the OST for about 4 months straight while finishing up my master's thesis. I effectively integrated the game into my daily life during a very hectic time, establishing a personal bond that sowed the seeds of future critical thought. Having put it down for 8 years, here we are. So here's how we're gonna do this. I'll do 1 episode per boss fight, and each episode will have 2 parts. In the first part, I'll discuss some element of the game that I think merits consideration, and that could be anything from a technical breakdown of the different weapons to an analysis of the aesthetic impact of Santa Destroy. Following that will be a 30-minute guest segment during the boss's level and fight. Also, I'm playing this on the Wii version. Its visual style is better, its controls are more visceral, and that viscerality is thematically important. And the sword impacts also pause briefly upon contact, making the combat feel meatier. In the PS3 version, the sword is butter smooth. It feels slippery and insubstantial, making this, I think, the superior version. I'm going to play off my legacy save file on the hardest difficulty, Bitter, with the weakest weapon, the Bloodberry. That'll make it good and challenging. For this first episode, I'm going to look at how the tutorial uses color, symbolism, level spacing, and Travis's monologue during the tutorial boss to narrate how Travis's life changes when he enters the United Assassins Association's ranking fights. I'll also look at how those same elements communicate the thematic significance of the player's bond with Travis. Toward the end, I'll also cover some basic player skills that I don't think the tutorial explains very well. And then I'll close by looking at how the themes of contradiction and rebirth make up the game's character and structure how it tells its story. So, let's go! In No More Heroes, through the main story and side missions, we uncover information about Travis's prior combat experience that is crucial for understanding what this tutorial means for his character. Travis knows how to fight with his beam katana, but he has not had a flesh-and-blood teacher. He watched instructional videos starring a man named Master Jacobs, and he practiced his skills alone in his room. He learned to fight through a kind of correspondence course. He appears to have learned some wrestling moves from a former Yakuza/pro wrestler named Thunder Ryu, but we also see him learn new moves by watching classic tournament matches on his VCR at home. Travis does pick up masks that remind him of wrestling moves before certain boss fights, but I think that these are more fantastic and imagined than they are autobiographical. We'll get to that later. The takeaway, though, is significant. Travis owes his skills more to mental imaging than actual combat experience. He's derived his style and his abilities almost entirely through the media that he's consumed. Now, to his credit, he clearly has exceptional potential. Sylvia hired him to kill the Drifter, who appears to have been a skilled fighter himself. However, that fight appears to have been Travis's first actual assassination job. Whatever the tutorial communicates about Travis's character must be understood within that context. Breaking into Death Metal's mansion and entering the assassination ranks indicates a departure from his previous life, and that life is not glamorous. He's an isolated 27-year-old American male, a local high school dropout without steady employment or many personal relationships. Instead, he lives within a cocoon of foreign, exoticized Japanese media. In this tutorial, he is emerging from that cocoon, even while he processes his experience through the imagery and stories that he's internalized, fighting with anime abilities and perceiving the world through vintage gaming affectations.
Fuckhead!
In these opening scenes, for example, he comes off as much cooler than we know he actually is. It's a rare moment of total competence that isn't really consistent through the game. He also has some cool repartee with death metal before the boss fight, but this is more or less a one-off, since most of the following bosses bounce him around the room with their special attacks before the fight properly begins.
It's game time!
The color scheme in this first tutorial area represents Travis himself. We can change Travis's costume over the course of the game, but his default costume colors are red and blue with a little bit of white. The game dresses him in these colors here at the beginning and also during the end fight with Henry, both occasions when he's entering and leaving the player's control, so these colors can be considered to represent his identity. Visually, this creates a sense of harmony between Travis and his environment. A familiarity suggesting that Travis begins with an identity that he knows and understands. A stasis that we, outside his circumstances, recognize as stagnation. The opening section is also decorated with tiger skin rugs on the floor. Cats big and small litter No More Heroes, but the game visually identifies big striped cats with Travis. His dark side meter in the upper right is a tiger. We see a tiger on the poster behind his commode at home. And we see tiger patterns on the back of his starting jacket, as well as on other jackets unlocked later in the game. No More Heroes equates big striped cats with Travis's virility and vitality. But these rugs are ominous objects. They're tigers' skins. These tigers suggest a deflation or emptying out of his familiar self, much in the same way that we look at the colors in this tutorial within largely empty rooms. The tigers and Travis's signature colors are paired with a sense of vacancy. Travis begins with an identity and self that he understands, but his participation in the UAA will drain that identity, filling him with something new. And that something new is the player. Travis emerges from that hotel full of mint-conditioned figmas and porn under the player's control. He exists anew in our hands. A skin rug, an empty room, and an idle video game character all lack something kinetic inside, and we as players fill that lack. And Travis welcomes that partnership. He acknowledges the player right at the start of combat, announcing a relationship that the player wants as well, at least in terms of how the game defines gamers. The game's introduction states that action game players want a fantasy to perform without reflection. Travis perceives his world through the lens of media fantasy, and one layer above that, Travis is the fantasy that the player uses to navigate a media world. Travis directly addresses the player only a handful of times, but the game sustains its awareness of the player before each boss fight. When Sylvia calls Travis, she tells him to use his force. Beyond the surface Star Wars reference, Travis's force appears to be the player who animates him. So, in conclusion for this first part, the opening section of the tutorial communicates two things at the same time. First, in terms of Travis's character, we see him releasing his familiar self and accepting a new identity. Second, we players supplement that identity as we join Travis fighting enemies in a space signed by his colors and his animal totem. The imagery thus far, bringing a deflated tiger back to life and making an idle video game character move, expresses one of the game's motifs of masturbation, particular to the kind of male gamer this game critiques. Folding all of these images into a single idea is where I think this game really shines. It's where I think No More Heroes is brilliant, beyond a mere surface-level cleverness. It is a send-up of both anime and the Americans who co-opt it, but its treatment of that topic is more multi-layered and sophisticated than it lets on. This interpretation of the tutorial develops in the next area, so this is a good time to break and talk about what's happening on screen. In the introduction, I mentioned that I'm playing this on Bitter with the Bloodberry, and this sword is not, in fact, the Bloodberry. There's a technical reason behind this. Bitter is only available as a New Game Plus option, and I saved my clear file after the final fight against Henry, which forces Travis to use this katana. This, in consequence, forces you to start the game with that equipment. So that's why this section is a bit, errant in that respect. The common enemies in No More Heroes are really well executed, since their designs all relate to the boss of each level. In this case, we see Secret Service-style enemies. When you save the game before the boss, the save file identifies this as the Townsend residence. Death metal is English nobility, and he represents the opulence and prestige that Travis strives toward, as we learn from his monologue during the boss fight. So the Secret Service enemies are appropriate. They communicate VIP status, and they characterize Travis by how far removed he is from their formality. In this second loadable area, the symbols established so far in the tutorial develop further. The first area featured a lot of enclosed spaces, corridors, offices, and bedrooms. There was a simultaneous sense of comfort and constriction. Pairing that with Travis's dominant red and blue costume colors created a sense of intimacy. And in terms of play strategy, enemies were easy to control because they formed lines in front of Travis. That level spacing reinforced the sense that Travis enters the competition from a sense of self that is familiar, but limited. In this second area, the spacing changes considerably, and this has consequences for play strategy. The player now has to maintain a greater sense of situational awareness. Enemies are more likely to attack Travis from behind. While this new space gives Travis greater freedom, that freedom comes at the cost of security and control. He doesn't need to worry as much about control, of course, because he's now bonded with the player. The color scheme has developed as well. White and gold now threaten to overwhelm red and blue. We see red in the long carpet as well as in the darker crimson on the far-out walls, and we see blue in the checkerboard pattern on the floor. However, Travis's identifying colors have greatly diminished from the first area. Travis's default costume does include white and gold in his t-shirt and glasses, but these are minor features. Because we control Travis from behind, we don't really see them that often. Red and blue suggest the dominance of his old identity, while white and gold indicate the emergence of something that was once peripheral. Travis's old identity is being replaced by something strange and new, the identity that he will explore as he ascends the assassin ranks with the player. And it's significant that that symbolic shift occurs right when we enter an area that is less secure and harder to control. The constricted level design returns in this second half of the second area, which might suggest a return to the first area's spatial security. However, this new corridor subverts that old association. The Secret Service enemies now carry handguns, and the linear path actually makes Travis an easier target, whereas the corridors in the first area gave Travis and the player greater combat control. The corridors in the first area were blocky, with hard angles, and this bounded stretch twists and turns. Even when we return to what's familiar, we find it destabilized. Now, in this next to last area, the changes in color and spacing develop along the same line. We've returned to the straight paths and right angles. The corridor is wide and the ceiling is high. White and gold dominate visually, crowding out all but the main hall's red carpet and the light blue checkerboard floor pattern. It's significant that Sylvia's pep talk occurs right when the environment has erased most of Travis's native colors. Travis is escaping his cloistered nerd world through the UAA rankings, and, appropriately, the UAA's main voice shows up to cement that connection between his participation in the tournament and his uncertain new identity as communicated through color and level design. Additionally, the music here reinforces how far Travis has wandered from his familiar self. The tutorial began with shredding guitar and No More Heroes' main theme, but here the music changes to a generic high church, organ, choir mishmash. This area has a cathedral feeling, associated with high culture and a spirit of reverence. It's a pretentious aesthetic that corresponds with the pretense of death metal's title, The Holy Sword, and its music clashes with the tutorial's opening in the same way as the level design. I'd like to break from that for a second to talk about these masks. These notes paint a dramatic history far too exotic for everything else that we know about Travis. And I think that they're part of his role-playing, the anime fantasy that he uses to process his new experiences. Going by the notes, Travis and the elusive MS have a relationship similar to Ken and Ryu's from the Street Fighter series, former sparring partners who bonded through their master's teachings. However, we later see Travis learn new wrestling moves by watching VHS tapes, and this appears to be his main way of learning new fighting and even sexual techniques. That is, without human interaction. His learning style contradicts the exaggerated anime backstory implied in these notes. Travis has internalized a certain drama through his media, and he now projects that back into his lived experience in the same way that he fights with wrestling moves learned on cassette. With our game saved, we're almost ready to tackle death metal. What we're seeing on the screen right now is pretty important, so I'm going to pause here to cover this. When Travis enters each boss fight, the screen is patterned over with stickers that reflect some aspect of the boss's character or design. These stickers reflect death metal's character as revealed in the contradictions in his introductory speech. They also reinforce the motif of contradiction evident in the symbolism we've looked at so far. To understand this, we need to look at the content here, explicitly. The sticker has a double image. In one glance, it appears to be a man wearing a robe covered in floral designs. The robe is open in the front, showing well-defined pectoral muscles, and the man's head is a skull. This, almost literally, is death metal's character design. On second glance, it appears to be a phallus with a skull in place of the head. This is particularly evident in the alternative black, white, and gray-colored version of the sticker, where the silhouette of the chest and head appear phallic in outline. Taking this interpretation back to the color image, the pectoral muscles even appear to be the outline of a scrotum. So this is very much a genital image. While the erectile imagery obviously relates to the game's broader motif of masturbation, I'm more interested in the pattern of contradiction that it reinforces. The phallus can serve as a versatile symbol, often associated with power and authority, as in Freud's symbolic lexicon. More broadly, in strongly patriarchal cultures, it also symbolizes life and vitality. This presents us with an image of power and life overlaid with a skull. It suggests a kind of entrapment, that power and vitality, qualities generally considered worth striving for, are their own kind of destruction. The flower motif surrounding the phallus also reinforces that sense of contradiction. As symbols, flowers are likewise associated with fecundity and vitality. They as well stand in place of genitals, typically representing the vulva, possibly gesturing towards Sylvia as part of the new, dangerous world that Travis has stepped into. Now, I hesitate to get too character-specific on that, though, since it's more interesting that flowers represent fecundity and vitality than that they represent Sylvia as a concrete, specific character. In full color, they decorate the image of a skull-headed man with an open robe, and in the alternative sticker, they point toward the phallic silhouette in ominous monochrome. As with the phallus, the flower symbols are juxtaposed with images of threat and death that suggest a kind of entrapment. It suggests that desire and death are the same thing. We'll get back to that idea in a moment. First, we should look at how that works with what the tutorial has done so far. Through the tutorial, Travis has moved from a place of enclosed darkness to a place of openness and light. Light, brightness, and open spaces are generally associated with safety, knowledge, and a known environment. However, Travis has discovered exactly the opposite in his transition from environments that were dark and closed to light and open. No More Heroes presents danger in the guise of safety, and it presents death in the symbolic guise of life. The stickers and the level design both communicate through contradiction, one of the game's dominant motifs, which I'll address the value of shortly. The level design's association of openness and light with danger reaches its height here as Travis enters a space open to daylight to confront his most dangerous opponent. The narrative significance of that shift, Travis's transition from a familiar to an unknown identity, also reaches its height as Travis faces off against a representation of his future self. The tutorial reinforces the relationship between Travis and death metal through color as well. The architecture no longer reflects Travis's colors, but death metal does. Death metal is the only figure in this environment that shares Travis's color combo of red, white, and blue, particularly in the colors of his body tattoo. Death metal's colors have a darker, more weathered tint, and death metal's skin tone suggests Travis's except more leathery, perhaps hardened by combat and sun exposure. Death metal's black pants also mirror Travis's black hair, effectively incorporating and redistributing the colors in Travis's design.
Well, you've had your dream, old man. Time to wake up.
There are other similarities beyond the color connections. Death metal has a demon tattoo on his back, while Travis has a moe magical girl anime shirt facing his front. These are totemic images, opposite each other both in tone and physical location. Death metal's hair is a more extravagant form of Travis's style, with a lot of sharp points groomed against gravity, and there's some inversion here as well, since Travis's hair cone leans toward the front and death metal's moves toward the back. Travis's pointed sideburns are exaggerated in death metal's long, pointed hair falling in front of his ear. Their faces are also similar, with straight pointed noses, widow's peaks, and dynamically sloping eyebrows, though the baby-face cleanness of Travis's face is offset by death metal's age wrinkles and pitted jewels.
You can take that to your grave.
They also share the same physical build and, it appears, height. There's another suggested inversion with a contrast between Travis's high-collared jacket and death metal's bare shoulders. Their weapons and stances also look like opposites, as Travis pits his standard-length laser sword held in front against death metal's gigantic buster sword-looking butcher blade, which he carries in a squat, open stance. So the tutorial redistributes Travis's colors and character design in death metal, leaving just enough similarity to communicate that they relate to each other, while also altering those shared elements in enough ways to tell the audience that Travis is fighting a demonically exaggerated version of himself. Death metal is the potential self that Travis is hurtling toward, a grotesque, visually alienated from the world around him. The tutorial's level design has narrated Travis's transition from an old self to an unknown, uncertain identity, and it ends with a grand statement of Travis's ambivalence.
Can't find the exit. Can't find the exit. Can't find the exit.
So now we turn to Travis's monologue to understand the struggles of that new self. Internally, Travis responds to his new situation in general, and to death metal's character in particular. Death metal's creed and lifestyle stand in opposition to each other.
I am free of desire. So long as I have this scenery to look upon, I need nothing more.
He desires nothing so long as he has this scenery to look upon, but he only has this scenery because of his fantastic wealth, which is evidence of desire. In the abstract, this opposition fits the broader pattern of contradiction seen in the stickers before. Its exact content takes on meaning when we hear Travis simultaneously reject and parrot death metal's contradictions.
Every day full of excitement and luxury. That'd be the life. I thirst for selflessness. Hypocrites thirsting for their own desire to get killed by young rookies like me. This is how it goes down.
So here's the analytic summary of Travis's monologue. Travis recognizes death metal as a vision of his future self.
This count. I feel as if I'm looking at my future self.
He rejects death metal as a hypocrite while repeating death metal's contradictions in virtually the same breath. Travis says that he thirsts for selflessness and rejects desire even after he lists high-end luxuries that he desires. He then switches perspective and looks at his story from the outside. He calls his situation a joke, a comedy. It says that there's nothing here for him and that he regrets signing up.
I guess you can call this a comedy. I realize there's really nothing here for me. Or maybe I should have been a little more careful before I jumped in.
And then he reverses directions again by affirming that yes, he should be here, and that something deeper than his instincts compels him to follow through.
Something deeper than my instincts is taunting me.
So he contradicts himself twice, once from within his situation and a second time about his situation, before he shuts down and ends his monologue on a note of dread, repeating multiple times that he can't find the exit. This scene has a third layer of opposition as well in the player's experience. We must, at the same time, perform and listen to Travis, and Travis, as an actor in the game, fights and actively doubts the value of fighting. Now, speaking broadly, and I touched on this when we looked at the stickers, the characters in No More Heroes gain their dynamism through contradictions. My on-hand examples come from my later guests, but we see this in the shift between new and broken-down schools in Shinobu, Destroy Man's double identity as a superhero in Khan.
Oh, this is great. Is this guy an idiot or what?
And Bad Girl's reflexive internal rage that she explains away as just a job, which it clearly is not. It's part of her. Each of the villains in No More Heroes suffers from an identity split by contradictions. Those contradictions don't resolve. They merely juxtapose each other ironically. So, as an example, in Dr. Peace, we see a tension between a bestial bloodlust and a beautiful singing voice. He builds up life by singing, a kind of celebration, yet he also destroys life in his other passion, his paying career. Those contradictions never synthesize into a complete character. They just lose momentum when Dr. Peace dies. I'll wrap up my argument during the actual fight against death metal and the following cutscenes. Right now I'm going to freshen things up a bit by shifting gears to talk about No More Heroes mechanics. First, we're going to look at dark stepping. When Travis dark steps, he catches the enemy's blind side and can land several rapid hits that do more damage than usual with a lower chance of getting hit back. There are two ways to dark step. First, you can either press left or right on the Wii Remote's D-pad before an attack connects. I call this pad stepping. Second, you can press left or right on the nunchuck's directional stick after an attack connects. I call this stick stepping. In my demonstrations, I perform only the inputs relevant to each maneuver. Showing actual gameplay would be more confusing than educational. Stick stepping is easier since it's done in reaction to an enemy attack. Here, I click the stick to the left after Death Metal's combo and dark step to his side. Pad stepping is more difficult. It requires knowing an enemy's attack pattern and anticipating that attack. Pad stepping is the same controller input as Travis's evasive roll, and here you'll see my inputs for the rolls and the dark step. You can actually fish around during an enemy's combo to pad step by accident, and this will help you get a feel for an opening. And here are another couple of demonstrations of stick stepping. Second, we're going to look at enemy clashes. The game explains this pretty well, in fact, but I want to add to that explanation by showing how I deal with sword clashes on bitter difficulty. On bitter, especially on bosses, these are much harder to manage. I found I had better results by pushing toward the Wii sensor. Some call it cheating, I call it immersing myself in the swordplay by pushing back against the enemy. Also, it was the only way I could do it. And a quick note on Death Metal. Midway through the fight, he will split into two shadow selves. You can't attack the real Death Metal while his shadows are on screen, but you can tell them apart by looking at their blades. The real Death Metal's blade will glow yellow, whereas the others will be dull. And a word upon enemy aggression. Enemies in general will wait for Travis to attack. Here, for example, Death Metal just dances around the level and only attacks Travis after much delay. In order to trigger enemy attacks that you can dark step, you need to aggress first and then go on the defense. Now, I'm going to wrap up my broader argument. At this point, I think it's important to define this word we keep coming back to, contradiction. There is a moral component here, hypocrisy, which Travis identifies in Death Metal. Avoiding hypocrisy is a fundamental part of maintaining integrity, which appears to be one of Travis's concerns, so it's not irrelevant. If we stop our analysis of these contradictions at hypocrisy, though, we lose the opportunity to see what's happening more deeply here. Contradictions are more than moral failures, bad formal logic, or cognitive dissonance. They comprise our identities, and they're not to be erased, but to be coordinated with each other. Understanding coherence as uniformity works for moralizing or for fixing symbolic logic and syntax, but it doesn't give us insight into either fiction or ourselves. In the questions about identity posed by No More Heroes, we can understand coherence not as a resting state of balance, but as a consequence of actively coordinating our internal contradictions so that we leave no part of our identities behind. That's the bigger value of contradiction that's happening here, and is what gives the characters an aesthetic weight despite the fact that they are simplistic grotesques. It's also pretty useful in figuring things out.
Keep going. Maybe I should have been a little more...
When Travis restates death metal's contradictions as his own, he reveals the seeds that could grow into the dissonance that we see in death metal, that lack of integrity where the oppositions simply move forward on their own momentum, unreflecting and without coordination. The concepts of desire and lack of desire might seem aloof from the way that Travis's character develops, but I think that they translate quite easily into the game-long tension between fantasy and reality. Fantasy comes from desire, a dissatisfaction with an unadorned world. Embracing reality comes from a lack of desire, an erasure of the ego that allows a person to immerse in the unaltered world as it is found. My solo segments in this series will explore No More Heroes, showing how fantasy and reality run parallel in Travis without resolving until the true ending of the game.
Let's go!
Death metal is a satisfied member of an older generation who failed to coordinate his internal oppositions, allowing each free rein at the cost of his unity and integrity. Travis will struggle to reconcile those very same oppositions that contrast as sharply as his character design does with the environment in death metal's fight. A struggle described by the tutorial's transition from closed spaces in Travis's red, white, and blue to open spaces in white and gold. This fight also establishes a theme of rebirth and cyclical experience that appears throughout No More Heroes. Death metal is identified as Travis's potential future self, but he's a member of the previous generation.
The name Holy Sword is now yours.
Travis begins his story by ending the life of a hypothetical, almost vicarious self. In the abstract, his birth and his death occur at the same moment. He doesn't borrow death metal's contradictions, he restates them in his own voice. In Travis, the same struggles are reborn. Travis is not destined to engage those shared problems in the same way, but he must, nonetheless, participate in the conflict between fantasy and reality that exists independent of his existence. This is poignant, and it gets at the broader value of what's going on in No More Heroes. You know, if we want a vision of our potential future selves, we can look to our parents, with whom we share certain problems of, mental and physical health, religious inclinations or disinclinations, socioeconomic class status. Our parents are not necessarily born again in us, but their problems are, with some modifications. The struggle between fantasy and reality explored in No More Heroes is similar, in form, to other cross-generational struggles. This theme of rebirth is not limited to Travis, incidentally. It's part of Jean's story as well. As a refresher, Jean is Travis's family-murdering ex-girlfriend and secret half-sister. Travis calls death metal's life a dream, and killing death metal is equivalent to waking him up. Likewise, when he kills Jean, he tells her that he hopes her next dream will be more pleasant.
I hope your next dream is a more pleasant one.
Life in No More Heroes is a dream, a place where fantasy and reality can become the same experience. After the credit sequence, Jean is reborn as a child, and this does, in fact, appear to be a more pleasant dream wherein she is cared for by Sylvia as a mother figure rather than being abandoned and abused. Though Travis rejects the title of the Holy Sword as an older generation's narrative, he inherits death metal's dream, not as an ambition, but as a struggle to exist in conflict with the same forces.
Congratulations. You are now ranked 10th.
10th, huh? What? Do I get anything?
To praise the way this is made again, the tutorial compactly describes the challenge that Travis deals with through the game. And this is a challenge that goes beyond a critique of a specific subset of gamers. It touches on a problem of inheritance that we all have to face. This is particularly relevant now when the current generation, at least in the UK and the US, a certain portion of it, has inherited its parents' model of ambition and success with much less opportunity to fill those outlines. In the game, the specific conflict between fantasy and reality transcends time and visits each generation on its own. The core idea there appears in Killer 7 as well, actually, and also in other games in Suda51's Kill the Past mythos. In Killer 7, Harmon Smith and Kun Lan are godlike entities whose friendship is expressed in struggle and takes place in our world during different times. Garcian Smith is Harmon's servant for the current generation, and Harmon exists independent of Garcian. It's a similar but not identical relationship here, I think, wherein the struggle between fantasy and reality visits all the death metals and Travises whose deaths inaugurate the next incarnation of conflict. Travis is going to struggle with his own version of that problem as media fantasy runs parallel to the sunburned reality of part-time jobs in a dead hometown. And that brings us to the end of Episode 1. Next time, I'll look at how the game introduces us to Travis's character while also teaching us about the overworld game, and I'll speak with our first guest about Dr. Peace. Thanks for watching, everyone.